Hey, how's it going?
I am doing great. Really, really great. I have moved into my office in my house, which I'm super excited about, though I'm curious about our recording today and if it's a little echoey because I haven't fully moved all of my furniture in yet. So I'm kind of in a big open room. Well, okay, I'm in a medium to small size open room, but man, I just was working a few minutes ago, looking out the window on these beautiful trees with my one bonsai tree being the only thing in the picture window. It was beautiful, and I am loving being in this space.
That's great. Well, welcome to your new space.
Thank you. How are you doing?
I am doing great. I have had this week off, and so I've gotten a bunch of things done, like repairing a chicken coop and editing some episodes of our podcast. We even triple recorded this week or something. So a lot of podcasting and lots of time at home with my family. Got to watch my son compete at districts, and he is now going to state in the shot put. And so, yeah, I'm super excited for him, and it means I get to take more time off of work too.
Man, well, I am sorry you were all cooped up.
Oh, boy, you really held that throughout my whole
I was waiting.
soliloquy.
I was so excited to use that.
Yeah.
I feel good about myself.
I'm glad you could get that out of your system. Well, what's on your mind?
Man, I am excited. We are talking about our second Revelation book today. Assuming we are both on the same page, we just finished reading Revelation Through Old Testament Eyes by Tremper Longman, who is
Is that the book we were supposed to read for today?
Uh-oh.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, you read it. I know you read it. But
yes.
Tremper Longman, who is a giant in the field of biblical studies.
Right.
And I don't know that I've specifically read anything else by him. So I was so excited to read this book and then incredibly excited to use this as a moment to dig into Revelation, now layering this book on top of the last book we read.
I know. I was looking forward to this too. This is actually my first official Tremper Longman read as well, though I have read other works that have either been compiled by him or edited by him. I think he does a lot of kind of the meta publishing kind of stuff. And so something that is authored specifically by him. This is the first time I've read anything. And as much respect as I have for him as a scholar and as somebody working in the field and all of that, I didn't actually love this book. I think we're going to have a good conversation, but I just didn't love the book.
I didn't either, but I'm giving the book a pass.
Okay.
Because why I didn't like the book, I think actually makes it an excellent book. But before I say why I didn't like it, why didn't you like it?
Okay. Well, it's Revelation Through Old Testament Eyes. What I wanted out of this book was a deep dive into the Old Testament context that helps illuminate what's going on in Revelation. Instead, what I got was some comments on the structure of the book and then moving into some notes on each verse of the book. And it's literally just notes. It's not a full commentary about every little thing. It's just, hey, this is kind of what this means, or this, it's just very chicken scratch type notes. I felt like it was the outline of what he should have written, not the actual thing he should have published.
Okay. With that in mind, I will say that I would agree with at least the majority of what you're saying. What I had hoped for was a book that was not even trying to be a commentary. I actually think that for the content of this book, taking the form of a commentary, which he did, was the wrong format. I would have loved a, say, 10-chapter book on 10 main themes, concepts, or ideas that you need to know from the Old Testament and how they play into the book of Revelation.
Yes. Yes.
That's what I thought I was getting into.
Mm-hmm.
That said, for what he was trying to do, which is sort of a commentary-ish book sprinkled with generally ideas from the Old Testament, I think this had a lot to recommend it. First of all, I think he did one of the things that annoyed me about reading it is how repetitious it was. He repeated himself over and over again when he was doing a major he has these sections that are like, through Old Testament eyes, and then he would talk about the topics that actually were the things I was interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And those were almost pull-out boxes interrupting the regular, verse-by-verse notation. Right. And so he would sometimes talk about the same thing and reference back and forth. So there's a lot of referencing back and forth, a lot of, I said this before, but let me say it again here. I was constantly being reminded as I listened to this book that this was designed to be a reference book, not a read-through book. And so
that is very true. It really does function better as a reference book.
Yeah. And so if I give it permission to be the commentary it wants to be, I definitely think more highly of it than if I ask myself, did it accomplish what I was hoping it would accomplish? I would still love somebody to write the book I want. But, with those thoughts, I'm curious, what did you like about the book?
Yeah, I mean, I did like some things about the book, even though on the whole, it was kind of a disappointment for me. I really felt like some of its strengths are, like you talked about, some of the structure. He really does a good job of pausing every now and then and saying, okay, we're about to go into this section, and here's what the structure of this section is trying to do. And so if we can today, I'd love to talk a little bit about the structure of the book and how some of these big rocks, if you will, kind of fit together. And he also does a good job of defining some of the symbolism. Now, it's not going to be like a perfect, oh, this is what this means, but just helping you understand how to read this symbolism. So I felt like that was really good. I'm hoping we get a chance to talk a little bit about symbolism as well. But kind of before we get there, maybe we should do what the title says it's going to do, which is look at the way that Revelation uses the Old Testament. So what are your kind of big takeaways from how Revelation uses the Old Testament?
Yeah, this is really interesting to me. There's two ways we can look at this. We can look at some of the specific examples, but before we do that, there's a methodology of how the Old Testament is used that's very interesting to me, and I think instructive to us as believers. And if I read both what Longman is saying and what is happening in the book of Revelation correctly, what didn't happen is that John, as he was writing the book of Revelation, I don't think he was asking himself, how do I intentionally cram as many images, ideas, allusions, or quotes about the Old Testament that I possibly can into 22 chapters? Right? Yeah. I don't think he had a copy of the Old Testament open next to him, and he was thinking, okay, I just had these visions. Let me reread Daniel, Isaiah, and Ezekiel so that I can get the proper language and, sort of transpose what they said and merge it with what I just saw and see what happens. Right?
No, because this is the water that he swam in, right? We use that analogy a lot. This is literally their whole cultural context as Jewish, or in this case, Jewish Christians. These are the stories that they would recite together as families, as communities, as a nation. And so it wasn't as though he had to try to think really hard about what images. He's trying to communicate to his audience. Of course he would use these images. Of course he would use these stories and these reference points because that's how they have communicated as a people for generations.
Absolutely. And this is where I think this offers us a way of approaching Scripture that is in continuity with our first century believer parts of the family that is a little bit different from maybe how we often approach the Bible today. I think we often approach the Bible as if the goal was to get something out of the text we're reading today, right? Like, what did I get out of this? What did this mean to me? What's a deep thought that I can have as a result of this? What application do I need to make of this to my life today? But it's always this text to me. Whereas for people like John, the value of reading the Bible today is that it's snowballing with all the other days that I read the Bible. Like you said, it's the water that I swim in now because I've spent so much time reading it that it's infiltrating everything about me, permeating everything that I think about, so that when I have this vision from God, I automatically interpret it in Old Testament language or in biblical language. You know, I was really reminded as I was seeing the way that John swam in the scriptures, I was actually reminded of the way that you often now read the Bible. If I understand correctly, generally speaking, whenever you drive to work, every time you drive to work, you just listen to some of whatever book you're focusing on.
Yeah.
For a long time, it was Isaiah. Now it's Revelation, right?
Yep.
And that reading is divorced from any quote unquote quiet time that you would have.
Sure.
Which is, I think, wonderful. Because all you're asking the Bible to do is sort of roll around in your head. And your expectation is, if I listen to this enough times, something's going to stick.
Yeah. Well, and I think about that even with John and John's audience, right? They have lived with these stories over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And so not only the content of individual stories, but the patterns that emerge from the stories themselves start to become clear. So to dive into some examples, honestly, this is where I really love what Longman had to say about Revelation's title, Babylon the Great. And he says, Babylon the Great was not meant as a code that others would not understand, but it was meant to draw correlations between Rome and Babylon. So he's referring to Rome as Babylon the Great so that the audience will make correlations with Babylon. But then I think it's even deeper than that because Longman has this really long section where he talks about some of the judgments that come in Revelation and their correlation with the 10 plagues on Egypt. And so I feel like by referencing back to these two things, John is pastorally telling his audience, yeah, you may live in Rome, the biggest, most powerful nation on earth right now, and it may be causing you difficulty in the way you live out your faith. That is true. But remember, we lived in Egypt once, and we were delivered from Egypt. We lived in Babylon once, and we were delivered from Babylon. And now you live in Rome, and as big and bad as Rome appears, you will be delivered from Rome, and Rome will fall. I think he's just showing the patterns that you learn from the Old Testament by using these words.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's intriguing to me the way this changes the way we understand Revelation and the way we ask questions about the book. We often, at least when I was growing up, and I assume you would have been taught the same thing, we would have been taught to ask, okay, which nation today are these verses symbolically talking about?
Yeah.
Right? And instead of looking at the book of Revelation, we should almost be looking through the book of Revelation, because the book of Revelation is saying to the first century audience, you should be seeing Rome, your current reality, as the incarnation of Babylon. And so if the first century church should have been asking, how is Rome the incarnation of Babylon? I think asking this question with any ignorance of the Old Testament is complicated for us today, because we shouldn't be asking, what nation today is Revelation talking about? But how is the nation that I live in an incarnation of the Old Testament reality of Babylon? Right? He's saying to his audience, you can't understand your modern contemporary reality without seeing it through this lens.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something we really touched on in our last episode that I thought was really, really challenging, because this text, the text of Revelation, is inviting us to critique our current experience in light of ancient Babylon, even Egypt, and even Rome, because we're at a different point in time. We can even look back at Rome's example.
And I'm also just struck by how well John knew intimately a lot of big chunks of the Bible, right? Like there are books he refers to over and over and over again.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. And it's fascinating because we happen to be reading this book and doing our Revelation study at the exact same time that we're kicking off our Summer in the Psalms series. And so in our world, we just recorded an episode on Psalms 1 and 2. And then not only Psalms 1 and 2, but all of the Psalms get used pretty consistently in the book of Revelation. And it's amazing to me how well John knew a bunch of different books, right? Psalms, Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah. He knew these books so well, but then each individual Psalm, particularly Psalm 2, really got brought up a lot.
Yes. Had we not done these two things so close together, I don't know that I would have caught it. The number of times, even just the staff of iron or whatever.
Right.
Is referred to, that is clearly a reference back to Psalm 2. It blew me away because we talked a lot in our Psalms 1 and 2 episodes about the idea that Psalm 2 was clearly interpreted by the New Testament authors as a messianic psalm. And for John, it almost feels to me like, and I know we could say this about any of these, but there's a way in which Psalm 2 provides the key to understanding everything that John is trying to say about the book of Revelation, about the warfare that's going on. And he clearly sees the Lamb, the Messiah, in the midst of both of these stories.
Well, yeah. And I mean, if we use Psalm 2 as an example, it's not just the fact that he sees the Lamb in these stories, but he sees the raging nations from Psalm 2 in this story.
Yes.
And the raging nations that are trying to cast off the shackles of God and not do things his way and just in active, open rebellion against God. John uses that imagery to talk about the Battle of Armageddon, right? Like this, which is an uncomfortable phrase we'll probably have to unpack a little bit later, but this final battle of Jesus, the Lamb, versus the raging nations who are in active rebellion against God, and how they meet at this mountain and have this climactic battle. He pulls so much of that imagery from Psalm 2, and I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole seals, trumpets, bowls, judgments that happen all feel like the outworking of Psalm 2. He seems to see this clash between the raging nations and the king who is scornful, dismissive, and establishing his own authority through his son, all as the story of the world, sometimes writ small, sometimes writ large, but the story of the world. And just the ways in which he has processed that are just fascinating to me.
Well, it is. And I love the way he's using the Psalms. I love the way he's tying these things together. But I was honestly a little disheartened to know that so much of Revelation is not just based on the Psalms, but based on imagery that we get from Ezekiel and from Daniel. And I tell you what, like, if there is a New Testament book that I have ignored, it is Revelation. If there are two Old Testament books that I have ignored, they are Daniel and Ezekiel.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. And again, I think the way he takes Ezekiel is instructive to me. The way I want to read Ezekiel is very limiting. How do I figure out what this means is a very limiting and somewhat stressful question.
Yeah, very stressful. Yes.
He seems to be asking, not how do I understand what it's trying to say, but how does it help me understand the world I'm in? Right? Like, he is just freely interpreting the world around him. When it gets into your heart and your blood and your eyes and your veins, suddenly you use it differently. And the point is trying to just cram it in there.
Yeah, which I think is probably a good segue to talk a little bit about symbolism, because that's honestly what symbolism is doing. And that's how John is using all of these different books, Psalms, Ezekiel, Daniel, even Isaiah. He's taking the imagery from it, and he's taking the general concepts, and he's allowing lessons to come from those concepts without being so precise on a one-to-one comparison or a one-to-one equivalency. And so I think that's a perfect definition of what symbolism is.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, I mean, the accurate usage of it would be to understand the purpose of the symbol and to use the symbol not in exactly the same way, but for the same purpose.
Yeah.
Which really leads me, again, to a methodological question. How do you read a book that is so richly symbolic in a consistent way?
Yeah.
I was reading in Revelation 21, and the end of the chapter is all this deeply symbolic imagery about the New Jerusalem. And yet the beginning of the chapter is this imagery about God living among his people, and there will be no more tears and no more crying and no more death and no more pain, because God himself will be their God and will be among them. And it's quoting kind of this language that the Bible has used over and over again. But I found myself thinking, well, clearly the New Jerusalem stuff with the pearl gates and all of that, that's symbolic. But this stuff about God, that's not symbolic. And I found myself thinking, I have no idea that if I can articulate a coherent way to read consistently in moments like that, where I'm not just arbitrarily deciding what's symbolic and what's not.
Well, right. And it does feel very arbitrary at times, because even, the experts, the commentators that we go to disagree about when to treat something symbolically and when not to. And I think the most perfect example, the kind of the elephant in the room when you talk about the book of Revelation, is the violence. Is the violence symbolic, or is it literal in some way? And so when we read Michael Gorman's book, the previous book, he really took this as symbolic to say, look, the text describes that Jesus comes with a sword in his mouth. And so this is not him wielding a sword in battle, cutting down his enemies. This is him speaking words of judgment, and the actual violence is symbolic of the destruction that comes from his words. Whereas Tremper Longman, he takes the opposite approach. I think he quotes another scholar, I forget whom, that basically says, just because this is symbolic does not make the violence any less violent. It might not play out the exact way, right? It's symbolic of whatever sort of violence happens, but it's still violence nonetheless. And so to what degree even do we interpret a symbol as a symbol?
Yeah, I was really intrigued by this because I could sense the flavor of Gorman in the book we were reading before, and he really made a big deal about this. And it was fascinating to me that Longman takes a very opposing view. Not that they would want to get in a fight or something, but on this particular point, they think two different things. And I actually wonder, I'm curious where you land on that. What are your thoughts about that?
I am still deciding. Just my 21st century lens really doesn't love the violence. And so if I can explain it away and feel good about it, boy, that sure would make my day. But the Bible doesn't operate based on my 21st century preferences. So I need to be more faithful to the text than just let me try to defend my preferences. And so I'm trying to step back and be more faithful to the text. And I think there is a good argument to be made that this is not as violent as we might think, that this is largely symbolic. But I also think there's arguments to be made on the other side, and a more plain reading of the text would indicate that there is some sort of violence, be it psychological, spiritual, physical, whatever. And so I think Longman may have a point. The problem is I didn't feel that Longman went into the specifics of that very well, so I don't think he argued his point well. And I would like to read better treatments of both sides of the argument.
First of all, absolutely. I would love one of those like five sides views on this particular topic.
Exactly. Going back to just the interpretation in general and how do we deal with symbolism, right? I think the disciples and all of the first century Jews expected the Messiah to come and conquer Rome. That is what they expected, because the Old Testament seems to say that he's going to put the nations to rest. The Messiah is going to deliver them. The government will be on his shoulders, right? All of these things that they thought, oh, that means he's going to come and conquer the way I expect him to come and conquer. And Jesus did come and conquer, but he did it in a way that nobody expected. And I think that's exactly what's going on with this sword in the mouth imagery. Yes, it has something to do with his words, but can we put an exact definition on that? Well, given the track record we have, I don't think so. But while we're on the topic of symbolism, though, can we talk just a moment about the numbers in Revelation? I feel like every time you turn around, there's John is either hearing something, seeing something, or counting something. Just numbers arrive everywhere.
Yes. How many numbers would you like to talk about?
I feel like the count right now in Sesame Street. 1, 2. So for me, I feel like the big ones, right? The big ones that I think repeat over and over and over throughout the book. The number 7. The number 12, and any multiple of 12 you'd like to talk about, the number 1,000 or multiples of 1,000, and then, of course, everybody's favorite 666.
I would love to talk about this for a second. I'd also like to add this fascinating phrase, time, times, and half a time to our list of numbers.
Yeah. Talking again about John's use of Ezekiel.
Yeah. But let's get to that one last. What were your thoughts about some of these? Were there specific questions or specific moments of enlightenment? What struck you about these numbers?
Yeah, I don't know that any of this is going to be shocking to the audience, or it was necessarily shocking to me, but I just found it very helpful to say, okay, whenever you see the number 7, we're talking about perfection or completion, right? Which is why we have the 7 seals, and we have the 7 trumpets, and we have the 7 bowls, talking about God's judgment being complete or perfected or at an end. This is the finale. It's all over after these 7s. So I think the 7 is really important. 12, this one was really fascinating to me. And I actually kind of want to know something about, I want to know from you what you think of this. So he's talking about 12, right? 12 is clearly the tribes of Israel, but it's also the 12 apostles. And so when he talks about the 24 elders surrounding the throne in chapter 4, Longman seems to say, well, this is a representation of both the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, showing the unity of both the Old Testament church and the New Testament church surrounding the throne. And I listened to that and went, what? Where do you get that? Like, nothing about this other than the number 24 and your little clever imagination would indicate this. But then later on the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem, you have on it written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then you have the 12 foundations of the New Jerusalem, and those have on it the names of the 12 apostles. And that's straight out of Revelation. And I go, oh, we do have these 12 apostles and these 12 tribes of Israel merging together in the New Jerusalem. So maybe there is something to this being represented in the 24 elders around the throne. What do you think?
Man, I'll tell you what, he didn't have to sell me too hard on that.
Really?
When he said that, I was like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. I'm in on that because it's such a random number. You know, if you're going to pick a number out of a hat, you're going to pick a round number, 20, 25. You're going to pick 100, something. To say 24 is so arbitrary. It seems like it has to reference something that I'm obviously supposed to know. And the unification of Israel and the church as one body makes as much sense to me as anything. And even I think there were moments, you know, like we get later on to the woman who is giving birth to a child. And I think it was Longman who proposes that might well be the church. But then we get to this question of, well, how is the church giving birth to Jesus? And that symbolism is completed and made very simple if we just say that one of the points that Revelation is making is that the people of God, Old and New Testaments, are unified, and that woman is the people of God. Suddenly it's like, oh, okay, yeah, all right. Then yes, the people of God gave birth to Jesus, and yet the people of God are the witnesses to Jesus. And so it all makes sense. And I was actually struck by this unification of Israel and the church as the people of God in this moment when their governing bodies are sort of unified. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, well, since that one didn't trip you up, I imagine the 1,000 isn't going to trip you up either, because 1,000 is just a really big number. And he just uses that over and over and over. Anytime he tacks on any multiple of 1,000, he's just saying, okay, really big. Lots and lots. Yeah. But then 666, he and others, I think Gorman did the same thing, have argued that this really refers back to Nero. What do you make of that?
That makes as much sense as anything. I mean, if my two interpretive options are 666 means Nero or whatever it is that the Left Behind series told me to think, if those are my two choices, Nero makes as much sense as anything. And what actually is the most intriguing to me is how much John pauses and says, hey, this is really important. You should pay attention because the wise can figure this one out.
Well, and he even says this is the number of a man. Like, he literally says it's the number of a man. So, like, hey, we're talking about a person here. But
yeah,
the clinching argument for me is the fact that, so this is kind of built on the gematria, the Hebrew numbering system, where you take a letter of the alphabet, give it a number, and you start adding things up. And you can write Nero as Neron. And if you do, and you do that in Hebrew, then you add all these letters together and you get 666. But what's fascinating to me is you can also write it in Hebrew as Nero, in which case you get the number 616. And there is actually a Greek textual variant. There's a manuscript that uses 616 as the number here instead of 666. And so the fact that like you can get to Nero in either variant is the clincher for me, where it just says, okay, this is clearly meant to calculate a man's name, and that man's name is Nero.
Yeah. And then I find myself asking somewhere in one of the, I don't think it was the context of the 666 number, but in one of the symbols, he says, the symbol isn't used to make it hard to understand. The symbol is used to draw or to create a sense of emphasis on something specific based on the symbolism. And so then I just find myself asking, clearly he wasn't, the issue here is not, I'm afraid of saying the word Nero. I'm just not 100% sure I buy in on that. So what are we trying to say here is the question that I land on.
I don't know that I have a good answer for that.
I don't either. And I'm glad we are not done with our Revelation study, because it is okay at this point to have questions that don't have answers.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So now I have to ask you about this time, times, and half a time.
Oh, yeah.
Stuff. Tell me your tell me everything that means so that I don't have to think anymore and you can do all my thinking for me. Go.
All right. Well, I'll do all the thinking and then you have to solve the riddle. So yeah, this is something that Ezekiel used and then John makes use of as well. And in Ezekiel, it literally says time, times, and half a time. So time would be 1 year, times multiple, so it'd be 2 years. And so we're up to 3 now. And then half a time, an extra half a year. So 3.5 years is how some interpreters take it. Other interpreters take it as, no, this was never meant to indicate any particular amount of time. It was to talk about intensity and duration and the fact that something would actually have an endpoint. So it would have a time, and then it would increase times, and then it would decrease half a time, and then ultimately stop. And so is it talking about the intensification process and the fact that this ultimately has an end, or is it referring to 3.5 years? And it's fascinating that John, he seems to at times just say, nope, it means 3.5 years. In fact, I'm going to calculate it down to the amount of days or hours or months or whatever. Like, he just dives all in on Ezekiel's use of this phrase as 3.5 years.
Yeah, as I have read that, Longman 100% sold me on the Ezekiel interpretation of this. That time, times, and half a time meant the thing is happening, it's going to get longer and worse, then it's going to be less bad, and then it's going to get cut short. Mm-hmm. And it'll be done, I promise. That totally made sense to me to such a degree that the only way that I could really, like, I wanted to sit there and say, John, you're either reading Ezekiel wrong, which obviously you can't do that, or just to think maybe John is so comfortable with all that imagery that it all gets sort of squished into when he refers to 3.5 years, or what is it? 1,440 days, whatever the number of days was, because he says it that way too.
Yeah, and he also says 42 months.
42 months, like all these different things. I wondered if they're all synonymous with, guys, we all know how long this is. And we all know this is the time, times, and half a time thing. And so no matter how I say it, you know that's what I'm talking about.
Man, it's quite possible. Yeah, I don't know.
And I'm definitely not trying to advocate for that. I'm just saying that would make sense to me.
Okay. All right. We'll go with the Josh from Missouri interpretation. Way to harmonize all of the views.
Yeah, that's I don't know what else to do with that, because everything in me reacts against numbering and dating and counting and right. Like,
yeah.
And again, like you were saying about violence, my 21st century evangelical reactivity to my own evangelical past is not a good excuse for an interpretive approach.
Sure. Yeah.
But it is, I do have to acknowledge that's where I am. And I don't want there to be real dates and numbers in there.
Right. Well, it's fascinating because I was just reading a review of Longman's book in Goodreads when I was writing my own review in Goodreads. And one of the commentators said, I don't remember exactly what they said, but other than wanting to get as far away from my dispensationalist past as possible, I don't really actually know much about Revelation. And I thought that is so fitting. So fitting.
Yep. That's about where I live.
Yeah. Well, as we dive in then to actually understanding the book, can we spend just a couple of minutes on the structure? Because I feel like there was actually some really good thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. I just appreciate on a big picture view the fact that this book kept tying things to the way it was structured. And this is going to sound very elementary, but this may be the first time I've been able to get the structure of the book of Revelation into my head in a way that made sense to me.
Ooh, please share, because that would actually be helpful, I think, for me and for the audience.
If we take the first and last chapter as an introduction and a conclusion, then really we've just got these letters, then this spiral of judgments, then what, again, we'll call Armageddon and get back to it when we get there later, and then new heavens and new earth. Right? That's basically the book.
Yeah, which I appreciate, because when you just say spirals of judgments, right, that takes the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, throws them into one big soup, and you move on. Which I think that's where the structure gets lost for me, is like, okay, wait, are we on the sixth seal, the fourth bowl, what are we on? And like, it's so confusing to try to fit these seals, trumpets, and bowls together. And are we talking about, there's 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. So are we talking about 21 discrete acts? Are we talking about 7 acts that are kind of described differently? Or, as Longman suggests, should we just understand it as a spiral, kind of this unfolding, almost recapitulation of events, but not in perfect sequence or detail?
Yeah, I loved this word spiral as well. And in it, to kind of add to the sense of the spiral idea, there's, I guess I don't know why I hadn't caught this before, but there's this fourth 7 that John is just told, don't write about that one, right? Which means we don't have all the information, and that's okay. It sort of added to me to the sense of, you're not trying to map this one-to-one. There's a lot going on here that you're going to be able to understand, and there's a lot of things going on here that you're not going to be able to understand, and that's all okay. Just get the big idea here that God's judgment works in this sort of way that it is God's judgment, that he is in control. Like, there really was a sense of control for me when I was reading it. And that it'll come to a sense of completion, even if it looks like it's getting worse.
Yeah, I think structurally, one of the main things that stands out to me, both from this book and our previous book, the fact that at the end of the day, this is a letter. This begins with a letter to 7 churches, and it ends with a postscript referring back to those churches. And this idea, which I really appreciated from Longman, that every single one of those letters to the churches said something about victory. And this is what it means to be victorious. In the end, not only is God in control, and there's this sense of control that's happening, but here is your part to play in the unfolding drama. What is your part? Stay faithful to the end. Period. Full stop. And that is the whole message of the book. Regardless of how you understand the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, whatever, this is a letter to the churches saying, all of this is going to unfold. God's got it under control. Your job is to remain faithful. Now do it. And that to me is so helpful in just grasping the big picture of the book and being able to apply it to my own life.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as you're saying that, I hadn't had this thought when I was reading it or even when Longman was talking about this, but as you're describing it, I'm struck by the fact that we often try to split up the 7 churches into the churches that have good things said to them and the churches that have bad things said to them and the churches that are faithful and the churches that are unfaithful. Like we always kind of divide it those ways. Mm-hmm. But if we were to divide it into the churches that have the potential for victory and the churches that don't, it would be 7 and 0.
Yeah.
And that's encouraging.
Yes. 100%.
But man, I was just so struck in Longman's writing about how important it was to understand the centrality of the temple among the people of God. This idea that the temple is heaven on earth. And therefore, the temple that Solomon builds, the temple that Herod rebuilds, that Zerubbabel initially builds, are these very, very limited sort of incursions of heaven on earth. And I think this is where Revelation struck me, this image of the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. If I'm a Jewish person steeped not just in Torah, but in Torah and temple, when the Lamb stands on Mount Zion, and it feels like he's painting this sort of like silhouette image. The statement of Jesus as the temple, the incursion of heaven on earth, becomes incredibly powerful. And then for him to make the argument that the 2 witnesses are the people of God and tying it in there, and then for him to wrap this all up in this one final image in which he says there was no temple in the New Jerusalem because the Lamb was their light and God was with them. To say that there is no temple, he says this so beautifully, there was no temple because everything was the temple.
Yeah. Well, and I really marry those images with the images from the end of Ezekiel, in which like there's this river that flows out of the new temple, and up from the banks spring all of this vegetation and all of these trees and all of this new life that flows out of this river that comes from that temple. And I think of the new heavens and the new earth as this very verdant, very life-filled place where God's presence has invaded every inch of it, and all it does is produce life and wellness and completeness and goodness. And it's such a positive image. And I love that you're left at the end of this book with that image. And then, John goes back to the letter form and says, now remain faithful so that you can inherit this. And then at the very end, it ends with this great prayer. Come, Lord Jesus. We want this new temple reality. That is what we want. It's so powerful to me. And I hope that as we continue this study, the pictures that go before it, some of the structure, some of the judgments, all these different things make a little bit more sense. But I hope that we gain a real clear picture of what our reward for our faithfulness will look like, what that new temple reality, that New Jerusalem reality will look like.
Yes. Which leads me to a very important thought that we always follow by a very awkward transition.
Okay.
Are you ready for something as important as a Which Josh question after that incredible theological and devotional conclusion?
Oh, yeah, because we can't end there on a real positive note like that. We have to end on something sarcastic,
that would be
ridiculous.
That would be other people.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you want a more serious treatment of Revelation, don't listen to our podcast. But thank you for listening to our podcast. All right. Well, let's do the Which Josh then. Which Josh apparently worked for an elephant. Man, this is really a bad transition, by the way.
Yes, but it does. First of all, it's me.
Okay.
And second of all, it ties into our study of Revelation, which is why I used it for this particular episode, specifically because it involves symbolism.
Okay. All right.
I have read every book I can find on being a middle manager or a leader who is under other leaders. And one of my favorites is this book by Stanley Bing, who is very snarky and delightfully sarcastic. And his book is called Throwing the Elephant: Zen and the Art of Managing Up. And it is written in this delightful faux Zen style, as if he were a Zen master speaking to his Zen student, except that what he's teaching him to do is teaching him to throw an elephant. And in the imagery, your boss is the elephant.
Okay.
And Bing used to be a commentary writer for The Atlantic. Like, he's just a brilliant writer. And so his entire point or way of writing the book is to say, trying to impact your boss is like trying to throw an elephant. Both are possible, but you need to know exactly how to do it or you're going to get hurt.
All right.
And so apparently I have worked for an elephant.
Well, hang on. I mean, this, by the analogy, we have both worked for an elephant, and really anybody who has ever had a boss has worked for an elephant.
Yeah, but I've read the book.
Oh. Okay.
But no, it is true. Officially, the correct answer is which Josh has worked for an elephant is both of us. And you just didn't know until now.
Okay. Well, maybe I will read the book someday and I get to join the Elephant Club.
There you go. The other Elephant Club.
What's the first one?
The Republican Party.
Oh, that one.
that we neither endorse nor not endorse, since we try not to have political stances on this particular podcast.
Particularly.
Exactly. All right. Are you ready to have another conversation next week?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. I'll talk to you then.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.